Shanghai GDG is a very interesting developer community.
I'm glad somebody has asked this question.
This is where the magic happens.
This is primarily a question and answer show. So if any of you out there would like to ask questions.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jarek Wilkiewicz, Google Developer Live. We have in the studio Jeremy Walker.
Yes. Hello.
How are you doing, Jeremy?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Trying to wake up this morning. Still a little early. On the Hangout, we have Jeffrey Posnick joining us live from New York City. How's live in New York, Jeff?
3 hours later, so I'm fully woken up and post-lunch and ready to go.
All right, great. And today, JJ Behrens, our fearless host, decided to take a step back and enjoy the view from the couch. So you guys can't see him, but he's in the studio, in person with us, laughing right now. Okay, so we have an exciting program for you today. We'll be talking about a not-so-secret, but not released set of APIs. We have discussed them briefly at Google I/O previously, so if you were at Google I/O, you might have participated in a code lab that Jeff and a couple of API developers have ran over there. We'll be talking about YouTube API v3, as well as our new Analytics API. As we mentioned in previous episodes of this show, these are right now in developer preview, so if you would like to use them, you have to apply using the developer console, and some of you might actually get to use them. We are still a little selective about the use cases that we want to test out before we launch the APIs, but hopefully it's not going to be that much longer. I know Jeremy is eagerly awaiting API v3 because I think he thinks v2 is kind of old, is it?
Yeah, I've started playing around with v3, and
yeah,
I do like it a bit more.
Cool. And then I think what we should do now is just transition over to Jeff, who is going to walk us through the intricacies of v3 using client APIs and getting the most out of the Analytics API. So over to you, Jeff.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes, because I think I could probably spend a couple of hours talking about these new APIs, and I don't think anybody really wants to hear me talk for a few hours. So I'm going to try to touch on some of the highlights. Start by talking a bit about the background of these new APIs and what makes them so different than what we've offered before. So, first of all, in the case of YouTube Analytics, we haven't really offered the same sort of API before. We've had a YouTube Insights API, which did provide ways of getting data related to your YouTube account performance, but that was a very limited API in that we only exported a zip file that contained a bunch of comma-separated value documents within it, and it's very hard to parse that information and to use it in a meaningful way. So, what we're going to be rolling out when we release YouTube Analytics API is a real full-featured, RESTful JSON API for retrieving all sorts of different types of YouTube reports. It's going to be similar in some senses to the existing Google Analytics API. Some of the report definitions look very similar. So if you've used that before, or if you've written code that's gone against it, some of that will also apply to the Analytics API. On the other hand, we have the v3 of the Data API, and as the name implies, we've also had a v1 and a v2. So this isn't something brand new in terms of the type of things that it offers, but we are going to be very happy to roll out some new features that are only going to be part of the v3 API. But the real way to think about it is that this is rewriting the APIs on a more solid foundation. These APIs are all going to be built on top of Google's new common API infrastructure. The previous infrastructure was referred to pretty much as Google Data or GData, and it was APIs that were written against that were all RESTful, but they used Atom XML as their native interchange format, and there were a certain set of client libraries that weren't particularly well maintained. They went against those older APIs, but because we're building on top of this new Google infrastructure, we're going to be able to take advantage of everything else that all the effort that Google is putting into their APIs across all platforms. So if you've used Google Plus's APIs before, if you use things like Google Latitudes, if you use the new Google Drive APIs, then you've already built on top of this infrastructure, and you already will be familiar with a lot of things when you get started with the new YouTube APIs. And as I mentioned before, these are all RESTful APIs, so if you are familiar with making URL requests and getting back data via that, this all should be very similar to what you've done in the past, except JSON, JavaScript object notation, is the native format. So you don't have to worry about parsing XML. We're not, as far as I know, we're not even going to be offering any sort of XML-based options. It really is JSON all the way. And I think a lot of people are going to be happy about that. We have a lot of folks who've previously used version 2 of the data API and had to manually specify that they wanted to get JSON back, but it wasn't the default. And I think that this is the right choice moving forward in terms of making it easier for folks to interact with the APIs. So I'm going to start a screen sharing session now and start showing off a few things related to the new API infrastructure, and hopefully this will be visible for everybody out there who is watching after the fact. But if it's not, we're going to share links to all these things that I'm covering, well, most of the public things that I'm covering after the fact, and we'll probably post that on our YouTube for Developers Google Plus page. So the first thing I wanted to point out is we have this really nice web page, developers.google.com, and this is the home for all of our APIs now, including YouTube APIs. And one of the things on there is a list of all the client libraries that we support with the new Google APIs infrastructure. So you'll see it's a pretty nice list. There are 9 officially supported client libraries for various languages. And I was actually poking around. I saw somebody is doing, I guess, an unofficial version of these client libraries for Perl, which maybe isn't as relevant today as it was 10 years ago, but it's still kind of cool that there are some folks, even if it's not an official client library, there are some folks who are taking it upon themselves to try to implement something that works against our APIs. But many of the major languages that everybody out there is probably programming against are covered here. I know that folks who are, for instance, Python programmers, and this just came up a little bit earlier today in the Google group, people saying, hey, why isn't there a Python client library support for version 2 of the API? Python folks have been kind of left out in the dust for a while, unfortunately, and I'm happy to say that we're going to have, full-featured rich support for Python developers in version 3 of the API. One of the things that's actually nice about the way the client libraries are set up, not just for the YouTube API, but for anything built on top of the Google APIs infrastructure, is that many of them dynamically generate the classes that are necessary to interact with the relevant APIs at runtime, rather than having to precompile, the classes ahead of time, and you have to make sure that your client library is always up to date, and that we didn't release new definitions of what the API will look like 2 weeks ago, and you just never updated your local copy of the client library to match that. The ones I know for sure are doing this at runtime with JavaScript, Python, and Ruby. And the way that works is that they will contact our servers. We have this central definition document for, I guess we're calling it a discovery document for the API, that just details all the methods and data types that the API supports. So when you run your code, the first thing it does is it'll download that document, it'll build up all the client descriptions that are necessary, and you never have to worry about your code being out of date or not matching the API definition again. So that's going to be a real benefit for folks who have kind of struggled in the past with client libraries that have been out of date. And like I said, that's not the case for every single language. I think for Java, for instance, we need to pre-generate some of those classes, but I think you'll see that we're a lot better about getting fresh copies of those class definitions pushed out when v3 is released. So one other thing to note about this new client library, especially for the Java version, is that it's fully compatible with Android, and this has been a bit of a pain point for developers who are trying to have in the past tried to use version 2 of the Data API on the Android platform. The existing GData client library wasn't really a good fit for the Android environment. I think there might have been some folks who've found ways to get the GData client library to work, but really you had to end up just writing your own, making your own HTTP calls and parsing the JSON data yourself if you wanted to use version 2 of the API on Android. So with once version 3 is available and once the Analytics API, everything I say here also applies to the Analytics API. Once those are available, you'll be able to use the official client library for Java, and there's going to be plenty of examples out there of how you could do that on the Android environment. Okay, so that's a little bit about the infrastructure. And one of the things that I feel bad about is that folks can't really play around with the APIs themselves quite yet. So as Jarek mentioned at the top, we're still in kind of a closed beta, or in some cases alpha, release of these APIs. So I'm going to show you the steps that you will be able to go through soon, for some definition of soon, to get started building against the APIs. And, file this video away. You could go back and look at it later. There's actually some other good video resources out there that explain these steps from the context of other APIs, not necessarily YouTube API, but a lot of these steps are common regardless of what API you're using. So I'll just walk you through that a little bit here. So what I'm at right now is what we're calling our Google APIs console. You can get to it by going to code.google.com/apis/console. And I have an existing project over here, and I'm going to walk you through the steps of creating a new one. So whenever you're building against a new Google APIs platform, you need to first register a project. And this concept is different for folks who might be, should I try a new one? It's different for folks who might be used to just, like, for instance, registering a developer key. If you're a version 2 developer, you probably are familiar with the process of registering YouTube API developer keys. This API console replaces the need to do that. And it's nice because it applies to all Google APIs. So you're not just registering a YouTube API developer key, you're registering one project identity that's common throughout all the APIs you're using. So if you're using the YouTube API and the YouTube Analytics API and maybe the Google Analytics API and maybe the Google Drive API all within the same project, you have one central place to manage that, all the things specific to that project, and that's the API console. So let's say GDL test project. Just create that. So the first step is creating a new project if you don't already have one. And you're then taken to this list of different APIs that you could enable. So before you could use any API, you just have to click and enable over here. And we're over here going to just say request access. That's the link that folks are going to see if they are not yet permissioned. And I'm afraid most folks are going to be in that state right now because I'm the one who controls the permission things to some extent. I was able to turn on YouTube Analytics API and YouTube Data API for my specific project. So sorry about that. But again, folks are not always going to be in that boat, but it is something that we are turning on for select users right now. Once it's fully available, you'll be able to just flip the switch and enable that for your project. And once you have that project set up, you can do a number of things. The relevant stuff that you want to think about is under the API Access tab. And this is where you get some of the identifiers that you're going to need to use if you want to talk to either the YouTube API or really any of the APIs that you've enabled for your project. So We have a concept of both authenticated and unauthenticated requests against the YouTube API. Unauthenticated requests are just requests made without the credentials of any given user. There are many types of requests that you can make unauthenticated, such as search requests, for instance, searching for videos or getting the contents of a given playlist, things like that. For those types of calls, you can look in the simple API access section of this web page, and you can get your API key directly from there. So that is just a piece of identification that doesn't actually authenticate you or have any authorization, but it just associates your API calls with this given API console project. So it's slightly different for folks who are used to being able to make completely anonymous calls against V2 where you didn't even have to specify a developer key. But it's not really that much of a burden to take that particular key and use that in your own application. So that's where you get the unauthenticated API key from. But all the interesting stuff nowadays happens with OAuth 2 and authenticated requests. So this is also where you set up your OAuth 2 access. For folks who are not familiar with OAuth 2 and maybe not familiar with the rather interesting, I guess, legacy that we have of various older and currently deprecated forms of authentication and authorization that the YouTube API supported at one time. OAuth 2 is what we're recommending everybody use nowadays, even with our older APIs, but it's the only form of authorization that's supported with both the V3 API, Data API, and the YouTube Analytics API. Everybody needs to use OAuth 2. There's no more client login, there's no more auth sub, and even OAuth 1 isn't something that we support. So I will post some links to some great getting started resources with regards to OAuth 2 on our YouTube for Developers G+ page, because it's a rather large topic. I've given talks about it in the past where I've spent about 40 minutes going over everything. There's even a book about it now, written by one of our colleagues at Google Developer Relations. So there's lots of ways to get started about that, but the important thing is that when you're setting up your OAuth 2 access, you need to generate things like a client ID and in some cases a client secret. You can get that information from here. And I'm going to end up regenerating all these key values as soon as we're done, since they're not particularly secret anymore now that they're being broadcast out there, which is actually nice. So you could go and reset these things rather than having to be stuck with your information being public. So I'll show you a little bit later where these values end up getting plugged in when you're writing real code that talks to the new APIs. But just keep in the back of your head, the API Access tab in the API console is where you go to generate that information. And I can just show you right now what that interface looks like, where you generate a new client ID. You choose whether your application is going to be a web application, an installed application, or a service account, which is actually a fairly new concept that we just recently rolled out. For most YouTube API developers, I think it's going to be either a web application, which is pretty much anything that's either run in web browser, really, and or an installed application, which could be things that are either command line scripts, or if you're writing code that's being run on a specific type of console or device that doesn't have a web browser, that would be another case where you'd use the installed application flow. So that's just how you create that. Okay, so I showed you how you could create a project. It's a little bit of a tease because you can't actually use those APIs yet in your own project, but where you can play around with those APIs is on this web-based interface to all the Google APIs that we call the APIs Explorer. And you get there by going to developers.google.com/APIs-Explorer, and I think that's all you need to go to. Yeah. And you'll get to see a full list of APIs that we have. And for our purposes, we could play around with either the YouTube Analytics API or the YouTube API directly in the browser. So again, this won't let you write your own code that will interact with the APIs, but it will let you make sample calls against the APIs and get the results back in a web browser. And you could do this yourself. You don't have to be permissioned ahead of time. One of the nice things that will also take care of doing OAuth 2 for us, so just flipping the switch over here, authorize request using OAuth 2. I'm going to split that, and I'm going to click authorize. And now I've gone through the OAuth 2 flow, basically. Because I was already logged in to my Google account, I didn't have to type in my username and password again, so it's just an authorization step. But now I've authorized the Google APIs Explorer to make requests on my behalf. And let's try some here. So let's, first of all, we could just do some universal search. This is truly universal search. If you were previously did searches against the version 2 API, you might know that you only got back videos by default. There were ways of doing channel searches and playlist searches, but they would be at different endpoints. So you couldn't really just do one search that would return the most relevant videos and channels and playlists. In version 3, you can. So let's try that to start with. So let's put in YouTube API. That'll be our search string. There's a couple of other fields that you can fill out if you want to, but we'll just leave them as default for now. And let's click execute. And we get an error in the server. So this is one of the reasons why we don't have things open up to everybody right yet. There are people doing active development pretty much as we speak on the API, and I had heard there was an issue this morning with doing unauthorized requests for searches, just due to some random bug, and I thought that an authorized request would work, but as it turns out, it doesn't. So play around with this maybe tomorrow or in a couple of days. That's specific to the search list, though. But there are a few other things that should work, such as doing a channels list. So I'm, in this case, going to try to retrieve this. This is the type of call that you make to get a list of your YouTube channel, basically. So you can see that it's doing a request against googleapis.com/YouTube v3 alpha channels. I'm saying that this is mine, and here's key your API key. The API's Explorer automatically fills in the key for you, so you don't have to register your own key, as we talked about before. So don't worry about that part. So you'll see the response. This is a very basic response. It shows me that I have this identifier for my channel, and pretty much just saying this is the ID, it happens to be a channel. And that's something that's due to the fact that I've only specified ID as the part that I want when I get a response back from the API. So this is actually a very important concept that's probably going to take developers some time to get used to when they start working with the v3 API. If you've done any development against the v2 API, you know that by default we give you everything. If you request a video entry, for instance, or if you request your YouTube channel entry, you will get every piece of metadata that is within the API by default. And it is possible to filter out some of that metadata, and a lot of people do that because they don't need to get I don't know, a couple of kilobytes maybe, or several hundred bytes worth of data back when all they care about is the channel ID, for instance. So in order to save speed, transmission time, and just optimize things, they'll say, bless you. They'll say, hey, I'll use the filter parameter and say that I only want the ID back. So that was how things were done in v2. We've kind of rethought things in v3, and we said, okay, well, instead of people having to specifically tell us what they don't want and by default giving them everything, how about we make people specifically say that they do want certain parts of the response, and if they don't ask for it, we don't give it to them. So this does mean that there's a little bit of work that needs to be done in your part in order to no pun intended, in order to determine which parts they want you want to get back in your response. But once you do that, you'll realize that, hey, you're getting back a lot more optimized responses than you used to. So if I put ID, which is a very basic part, I will only get back this identifier over here for my channel. I could also put in the content details. There's another relevant one. And these are all in our documentation right now. So, I'm trying to remember a few relevant ones, but I could actually just pop over to the docs and take a look. But just adding in that content details, though, that created an extra subsection within the JSON response that has all the content details, and in this case, it has the identifier of my uploads list and the fact that this is a public list of videos. So let me just pull up our docs real quick. See the big experimental next to version 3. And I'm going to be doing a channels list. So I'm going to go to reference, channels list. And I'm going to look over here. It says parts. And you can see a definition of the types of supported values for parts. So we have ID, content details, snippet, and statistics. So let me actually include all that and just show you the full response that you get back. Okay. And just a comma separated string. Click execute. And so you see a bunch more data, and this should make it should be more familiar for folks who have done V2 type responses and are used to getting back things like the number of views for all the videos in your channel, the total number of public videos, number of subscribers, a thumbnail for my account and its title and things like that. One interesting thing is the part that was entitled Snippet. Most of our API endpoints do support the snippet part, and this is kind of a shorthand that we've come up with to say that you want to get back the most relevant information in a response that would be useful when displaying that response visually somewhere. So the type of things that you need when displaying something visually are usually a title, description, some sort of thumbnail. That's usually enough in order to give you a very basic visual representation of something. So that's the type of things that you get back in the snippet. You get back a title, you get back a thumbnail. My channel doesn't happen to have a description, so there's nothing there. But you'll see the same sort of thing if we, for instance, do a video query. So let's just pick a video ID real quick, and just grab one from our Player API demo page. That's always a good place to get a video ID. So we have that ID, and we're just going to go back over here to videos list. We'll put an ID that, we're going to put in parts snippet. Do an execute, and here we'll get back something very similar to folks who are familiar with version 2. Title, description, tags are useful. Get those back in the snippet. Get back the video category and various thumbnails. It's I don't. This is a little bit specific to folks who have written code, especially doing JavaScript parsing of version 2 responses, but you'll know that it's very difficult, for instance, to figure out what the high quality thumbnail is for when you're parsing a V2 response. You kind of have to iterate through all the items and check one of the JSON attributes, and it's quite annoying. So, one of the nice things that we've done is made it so you can just do thumbnails and then do the thing that has the property value high within that, and then get the property of the URL. And makes things a little bit easier. So we've tried to make those types of little changes throughout the API. Okay, so those are a few examples, and try a little bit more on yourself, on your own. I'm not going to show off the analytics API right this second, mainly because I don't have very useful information in my accounts. But you could do the same sort of requests over here. It's a little trickier to format the proper values for like the IDs field, for instance, which needs to be set to like content to channel equals the channel identifier string, which is something distinct from your username. So you're going to have to spend a little time looking through the docs if you want to get started on this completely on your own. Otherwise, you can wait until we release some sample code that makes it a little bit easier for folks to use these new APIs. But just want to throw out there the fact that people can play around with the Analytics API now too. So one thing that I just want to go back for a second and talk about, because it's another thing that's important when thinking about the API, is the fact that, so let me put in content details, ID, and no, ID true. Okay, there we go. So you'll notice that we have returned for the uploads this U, and then pretty long string of characters identifier. This is our way of moving towards a universal, I guess, namespace for different types of video lists and making it possible to retrieve any type of list of videos using a single API method, regardless of whether it's a list of videos that somebody has uploaded, or it's a list of videos that somebody has favorited, or it's a list of videos that belong in a given playlist, or if it's a list of videos that a user has liked in the past, which is something new that we're going to be rolling out. All of those things correspond to specific, I guess we're calling list identifiers that have different prefixes. So UU is the prefix being used for the uploads feed, more or less. And PL, many people have seen the PL prefix used on list identifiers on the website in the past. So those same PL identifiers can now be passed directly into methods in the API. So I'm just copied that. I'm going to show you how that's done. If you do playlist items list, I'm going to put in, I guess, snippet 19. And I'm going to put in the ID of my, oops, actually. In the playlist ID, I'm going to put in the ID of my uploads list. And click execute. This should work. And this will show me all the videos that are uploaded in my accounts. So again, this would have worked equally well if I put in like a PL ID over here, if I had an actual playlist ID. So we're treating lists of videos as if they were just lists of videos, regardless of what their origin is. And that should make things easier from your end in terms of implementing code. So just one other thing I wanted to point out. Okay, so I've showed you a bunch of demos that are done in the web interface now. I've talked a little bit about the APIs console. I did want to show some very preliminary Python code in this case for doing some of the same things that we've done before via the web interface. So in this particular case, I'm going to show you a Python example that's using the Google API's Python library that will make an authenticated request to my channels list to get the uploads list identifier, the same identifier we were just talking about previously, and then it will take that identifier and make a playlist items list call to get all the videos in my uploads feed. So it's pretty much exactly what we just saw in the web interface, except some Python code to do that. So before I run through the code, let me show you what it actually looks like. So I always like doing that first. So we're going to run my uploads.py, and you'll notice that it immediately will take me to this page where I can click Allow Access and complete the OAuth 2 flow. So this is PASA, and you'll see a list of all the videos in my account, including a bunch of videos and my son. So this is possible because we are using the Google API's Python client library, and that has a really good support for OAuth that's already built into it. So we don't have to worry about the details of actually handling the redirects, for instance, or even persisting the credentials after we've authorized for the first time. The client library will take care of all of that for us, and I'll show you how. Excuse me, from looking at the code. And one other thing to note is that the second time we run it, I don't have to go through the OAuth 2 authorization again. It'll persist those tokens for us and it'll reuse them. So, while it might seem a little bit weird, hey, why do I have to open up a web browser when I have a command line installed application? Yeah, that's not ideal for automated processes, but you only have to do it once. And as long as you don't revoke your OAuth 2 credentials, you can reuse those cache credentials pretty much indefinitely. So in that respect, you don't have to store your username or password anywhere on the local file system. You're storing these opaque credentials in a file that only your user has access to. So it really is a win from a security perspective, and it's really, really not that much harder than doing something like client login with username and password. Okay, so yeah, I can't talk about all the details of how the Python client library handles things. There's a lot of magic that's going on, and Joe Gregorio, who's on our team and wrote this, did a wonderful job of that. And he's made it so that you just put in a couple lines of code, and it'll take care of, for instance, the whole OAuth 2 flow for you. So this literally is all you need to do to do OAuth 2 from within your Python application. You have to initialize this flow object, and you're saying you're loading the flow from a client secrets file. Client secrets file is a file that contains your JSON. It's a JSON formatted file that contains the client ID and the client secret and the redirect scopes and a few other things that came from the API console in a previous call. So you just store that somewhere locally. There's some spec for how you create that client secrets file. I don't want to go into it right now, but there's spec for how to do that linked to from the Python client library. And here we say that we want to do the scope of the YouTube. And we're saying the next line that we want to use this particular file for storage. So I'm just, hold on 1 second. Here's some pings in the background, I'm sorry. So we're saying that we want to do use this particular file for storage. And I'm sorry, Yarrick or Jeremy, interrupt me if there's something I should be doing now.
I think we are mesmerized by your code, Jeff.
Pardon?
We are mesmerized by your code, so
Okay.
you're in a trance right now,
Fair
salivating
enough.
over that Python code.
You know what? I am always embarrassed showing off my Python code in front of JJ in particular, because he's a true Python guru. So, JJ mercifully is not on the camera today, otherwise he'd probably be, talking about my indentation, for instance, which is the worst thing you could get reprimanded for if you're a Python programmer. In any case, though. So we have we have the definition of where the local file is for storing the credentials, and we try to reuse the credentials over here. So we see if the credentials are valid. If they are, we'll reuse them. If they're not, then we just go through the whole flow, which opens up the web browser for us automatically. It'll actually run a local web server for us. So the web browser will end up redirecting to a localhost URL, and that Python web server that's running will listen for the response, and once it gets the response, it'll complete the OAuth 2 flow for us without us really having to intervene at all. So it's super nifty. And at that point, we create this YouTube object, and over here we're doing what I mentioned before, where it generates the client bindings on the fly, more or less. So what we do is we call the build method, and we say, I'm using the YouTube service and the v3 alpha version, and it's going to go and download the discovery document for us, and it's going to build all the necessary bindings that we need without us having to have that pre-compiled or stored anywhere ahead of time. So it's always going to be fresh. And at this point, we're doing a channels list call on that YouTube object, specifying the same sort of parameters you saw in the web UI. And we're going to then iterate over the response. So we get back a list of channels. We iterate over that, and I only have one channel, which most people certainly would, and it's the content details uploads list ID that we want to grab over here. And we're then going to pass that to this YouTube playlist items.list call. Very similar again to the web interface. So the playlist ID is that ID, and the part is snippet, and we can then iterate over the response. So again, this is all JSON data that you get back, and it gets, I guess, deserialized into Python objects that you can then interact with. So we're grabbing the title, and we're grabbing the video ID, and I end up printing that out in the user interface, looking like that. So that's a really simple example. We're going to release some examples for doing analytics reports in the near future. We're going to list, I would show you the search example right now, but the search service isn't currently working the way it should, so it wouldn't be a good demo. And yeah, we're going to be trying to get out as much sample code as we can, as soon as we can, perhaps even before the public before the public release of both the V3 and the Analytics API, because we know that sample code is really what a lot of developers go on when they're getting started with any sort of new API. So if you don't hear too much from me in the Google developer forums, it's because I'm head down writing sample code for everybody. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to show for now. I've used a nice chunk of time, and as I mentioned, I probably could end up using a lot more. So if you ever see me on the street, just in New York City, feel free to corner me and ask me about any sort of API questions. I get that so much. Paparazzi just following me around and wanting to get early access to V3 or wanting to know random things about V2. So feel free to do so.
Actually, I think JJ, if he were live, he would have said that you actually predict what questions people are likely to ask, then you follow them and answer before they have a chance to ask them.
Yeah.
Is that right, JJ?
That's right.
All right, JJ is nodding his head.
Well, that's using the Google Prediction API, which is one of the APIs we didn't cover. But yeah, add the Google Prediction API to your own code, and you can do the same.
So you're training the algorithm while people ask you questions. This is your
Exactly.
secret. All right, so we have a few questions. There were actually questions on the live stream in the comments section, as well as in the moderator. So let's take a few. So let's start with the moderator. The top rank question is about obtaining video thumbnails that look like a storyboard. So there's a question whether our existing version 2 API provides that in API responses. And I think the answer is no at this moment. Right, Jeff?
Yeah, so we do expose 3 different thumbnails from most videos that are tagged with, I think, start, middle, and end. That is different than what I think the person's asking about, which is, they've noticed that the YouTube player for a lot of videos, I don't know what percentage of videos nowadays, but a lot of them lets you kind of like move over the scrub bar with your mouse and you see a thumbnail of that given point in the video. So that's something new that we've started doing. We're not exposing, that level of thumbnail data via the API. Kind of doubt that we ever will. I couldn't say that for sure, but I'm not aware of any plans for us to do anything more than the beginning, middle, and end.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff. Again, if this is something that is important and you guys feel like we should, then please file that in our issue tracker on the public side. It's linked from youtube.com/dev, and we'll push on your behalf to see if we can make it happen. But as Jeff mentioned, right now, no plans. Next question is about retrieving multiple parts of a response. So as Jeff mentioned, there's a convenient way to obtain, for example, snippets that will give you a set of data elements relevant for display. Now, what does response look like if you actually ask for more? Can you do that first, and then what does it look like?
Yeah, you definitely can. So I'll just pull that up again via screen share. That'd be the easiest way to do that. Let me try to share just the window this time. So if you go to the Google APIs Explorer, and I guess the most relevant way to do it is for the example where you do the videos list. So let me just pull up that video ID. So yeah, ID is just a comma separated. Sorry, part is just a comma separated list of parts, and if you specify multiple ones, it'll be the union of all those parts. And if I go over here, reference, say videos list, and I take a look over here. Oh, actually, one thing to note is that instead of just going to the APIs Explorer, we do have like an embedded version of the APIs Explorer that is tied to the specific service that you're looking at in the docs. So right now I'm looking at videos list. And if you go over here, you'll see pretty much the same user interface. It's really just like a tiny subset of it. But it's already on the users list method, so I can just put it over here equally well. Let me do that instead. So let's just get the list of parts. Copy that over here. A whole bunch of different parts are valid for this. I'm pretty sure. Well, let's actually try to see if we have spaces in there, whether it likes it. Okay, so it's happy enough even with spaces. Okay, so this just shows you, and here if I take a look at like minimizing some things, which is a nice thing to do in the UI. So you'll see, you have this parent element, parent container element, whose value is actually the same as the ID. So this makes it easy if you're looking at multiple video IDs at once. For instance, you can specify like 3 or 4 or whatever video IDs. You'll know what part of the response corresponds to the specific video ID you're interested in, just by using that ID as a key. So in this case, we're only looking at 1. But within here, you'll see there's a snippet item, there's the content details, statistics, status, and player. And those each have their own subsections with information within it. So you could definitely specify as many as you'd like, or as few as you like. If you only want to know what the view count is for a given video, then all you need to do is put down statistics, and you won't get all that other information that you don't want.
Cool, great, thanks, Jeff. There is one more comment in the moderator. It's in English and in Mandarin, I suppose. It's like. So my response to that is thank you very much. And I'm not really that good with Mandarin, but I will answer in Polish. Dziękuję bardzo. Let's transition to a couple of the questions that I saw popping up in the live feed in the comments. So one question was about YouTube on iOS as far as the API is concerned. Is there a new YouTube iOS API? And I think, Jeff, you were talking about the different client libraries. So I think the question really is, what about iOS? Is the V3 actually helping developers in any way?
So there definitely is a client library for Objective-C that will be available for use with both version 3 of the API and the YouTube Analytics API. It will help developers, but it's actually interesting in Objective-C because we didn't really have quite the same problem with the Objective-C client library in V2 as we did with maybe Java, for instance, or Python, where either the bindings were pretty out of date or there was no real good support for OAuth 2. That really hasn't been the case with Objective-C. We have a fantastic maintainer of the Objective-C library, Greg Robbins, who's been really good about adding new things to it. So it's not like you were in very bad shape if you wanted to use the Objective-C client library with V2. That being said, it'll strictly be a better experience. I think I could say with some degree of certainty if you're doing V3 programming using the Objective-C client library. And it's definitely something that should be supported.
Great. And 8 other languages, right?
And 8 other languages, yes.
Sounds good. Couple of final questions since we have a few more minutes. So there was one question about embedding videos on one site from a YouTube channel. So if someone has a bunch of videos uploaded, how can they easily embed them on the channel? And then can they actually decide of how the videos are presented? There was a specific question about determining the order by sorting based on tag values, or maybe any part of metadata. Any hints of how that can be done? What are the possibilities there?
Okay, so I want to make sure I fully understand the question. I'm not sure you're the person to clarify it or not. So let me answer the assumption that the person has a list of videos, either already like in a playlist or already in their account, or maybe just a list of arbitrary video IDs, and their goal is to display them in an intelligent fashion on a web page in some sort of player. Does that kind of sound like a
sure, that's a general case. I think the uploads case was another one, the simple case. So maybe we could cover both.
Sure. So what you would want to do in that particular case is use our standard embedded player, but make use of its list playback capabilities. So we talk about that a little bit in a blog post. And here, since I'm in the screen sharing mode, let me just pull up that particular blog post and try to make it a little bit bigger. Just so folks know what I'm talking about here. So if you go to our blog, which is at apiblog.youtube.com, you could just search for list, just like I just did, and you'll find this blog post. And we talk about how you could use our standard iframe embedded player, but use some parameters over here that let you say, okay, I would like the player to be populated with all the uploads within this username, Google Developers in this case. Other types of values that you can do is say, I would like this to be populated with all the videos in a given playlist. So you say playlist over here, and you put in the playlist ID right over there, and you'll automatically get a player that will, load up everything in the playlist and play those back to your users. It is actually kind of nice because you get these little thumbnails on the bottom. Let me zoom in even more so you can see the thumbnails I'm talking about. So you could get these thumbnails of all the different past videos so that users could just jump to the specific one that they want to go to. Getting started with Google Compute Engine in this case. So that's kind of our recommended way of doing it without having to write too much code of your own. If you did want to write more code, feel free to do so, and you can use our data API, for instance, to get the contents of a given playlist or the contents of the user upload speed, and then take all those video IDs and present them in any fashion that makes sense to you. That's kind of really up to the developer.
Great, thanks, Jeff. There was one question asked by someone on the live stream. Where can they find more information about the API? Jeremy, since I know you've been right in the middle of trying to figure out all the intricacies of the API, where would one start from your experience? What's a good starting point?
Well, if you look on the site where you normally get the version 2, there's actually a version 3 link right above it that says experimental, and you can go into that. There's some good samples in there that I, in fact, started playing around with, and also great documentation that breaks down all the parts that Jeff went over and how to get different parts of that back in your responses. So if you just go to the main YouTube API page, you'll see it under the Data API section as version 3 experimental.
Thanks, Jeremy. I know you've been studying it very carefully. All right, so we're almost out of time. There's one final note that I wanted to make. If you guys would like to help us with developer activities, we are hiring. If you go to developers.google.com/jobs, you will see some of the positions that we have on our team. It is a lot of fun, and as you can tell, there's a lot of new APIs coming out. We work with a lot of developers, entrepreneurs, large, small companies. We engage in the community, online, live hangouts, so a lot of different types of things that you might find interesting. So if you would like to check it out, please do so. And I think this wraps it up for today's episode of Google Developers Live and YouTube Developers Live. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you next week, 10 o'clock a.m. Wednesday Pacific.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.